And now, nope, that's not what I wanted to have. Right, so this is the one, this is what the labeling bought you, right? So we have this, this is much easier to read because you don't have this MB2YTO underscore dot 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 stuff. We have the names of the variables. And that's exactly, just to show you, right, that's exactly the set of coefficients that the IMF gives you in its publications, right? You see minus 0.29. So I think, I mean, there used to be a time when the International Monetary Fund was kind of just people in dark suits and white shirts and ties showing up and telling countries what to do. And say, look, we know better, and you do what we tell you, otherwise you don't get any money. This is not longer the case, right? I think the IMF is now a much more open institution, and is now some 30 years ago, this wouldn't have been disclosed. You wouldn't have had access to the data. You wouldn't have had access to the do file. The discussion that we had, well, it's not a discussion. It was kind of a sermon. I wouldn't have known what the IMF did, right? Now I know. I can criticize it. And the fact that an institution like the International Monetary Fund exposes itself to that critique is this is very academic. I mean, this is very transparent. So I think that I have a lot of respect for that, right? So and I find that super yeah. Let's hope that the American government doesn't put its hand on these institutions. Maybe they will. I mean, there's some hope that the president doesn't know about the existence of these institutions, and so he doesn't have them on the radar yet, because they're very important. I mean, these are IMF, World Bank. They are kind of coordinating policies in a way that is very useful and very important. Okay. So, right, let's go into, that was the 5th problem set plus some panel data, econometrics, footnotes. And now let's go back into what we wanted to know about the real exchange rate. Now that's what we did yesterday. Good, okay. And that's where I'm entering today. Okay, now this is where okay. Here you have GDP per capita, PPP adjusted on the horizontal axis relative to the United States, and you on the vertical axis you have the price of a standardized goods basket in 2015 relative to the US. If you have a question, ask me. Purchasing power parity. Those people who were here, no. Good. But you have time to catch up. Okay, now please note, and that's what I'm figuring out here. It's this is kind of the is the price in Brazil divided by the price in the United States times the US dollar Brazilian real exchange rate. So it's like an inverted real exchange rate. So this says that the real exchange rate is very high. That is, from an absolute purchasing power parity point of view, you would say it's undervalued in poor countries, and it's very low. So from a PPP point of view, we would say these currencies are overvalued in rich countries. Or put differently, this basket, this standardized basket of goods, is expensive in rich countries and is inexpensive in poor countries. Now, let me show you something else. Now, what you see here is data taken from the January 2022 Big Macs example, Burgonomics thing. Remember, and I'm jumping up, or jumping back. Here, right, you have these, in the last column, you have the overvaluation or the undervaluation. So when it's an undervaluation, that means that A, the currency is undervalued relative to absolute purchasing power parity, but it also tells you that the Big Mac in these countries, if translated into US dollars, is 59% cheaper than in the United States. For example, Taiwan, that was the case. Now, going back to the slide I've just put up, these are the over and undervaluation numbers or assessments of the economists for January 2022 related to GDP per capita. And it shows that conspicuously undervaluations are present in poor countries, and rich countries tend to have overvalued currencies. Right? Now, if you are married to absolute purchasing power parity, you would say, well, you know, that's just a coincidence. Next year it will look differently. The thing is, we get that year after year, consistently, right? Poor countries' currencies seem to be undervalued. Rich countries' currencies seem to be overvalued. Switzerland has an overvalued currency. Thailand has an undervalued currency. Up to a point where you start wondering, are these currencies actually over or undervalued? Or isn't there something else going on? Right? Now, please, one more thing before we continue. We have enormous heterogeneity for the poor countries. So we have some countries, in fact, where the Big Mac is cheaper than in the United States, but it's not very much cheaper if translated into domestic currency. And you have other countries where the Big Mac is really much cheaper. Now, this is interesting, and it indicates that maybe there's something else going on, namely that, so the point that I will make is that we have good reason to believe that the Big Mac should be cheaper in poor countries than in rich countries. Well, let me come back to this. Let me come back to this when I later on. Sorry about. So, here's another thing. This is the evolution of the Czech Republic's real effective exchange rate, and please note I've inverted the thing, so a decrease is a real appreciation. So when the Iron Curtain fell or was lifted in the early 90s, the Czech Republic integrated into the European economy, into the world economy. And you see that since then, the real effective exchange rate has dropped dramatically, meaning that the Czech krona has appreciated big time in real terms. Now, this is something that we observe for the Czech Republic, is something that we observe for Poland. For a lot of these Central and Eastern Europe economies, we saw that there was a massive real appreciation in the aftermath of the lifting of the Iron Curtain. Now, if you are a fan of absolute purchasing power parity, or even if you're a fan of relative purchasing power parity, you would say, oh, well, you know, this went down, but it's just a matter of time until it will go up again. Remember, going back to the Switzerland, to the Swiss case, right? Here you see that when you look at this US dollar Swiss franc CPI-based real exchange rate, you see it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up. There's something like some stationarity of the real exchange rate suggested by the time series. Oh, of course, whether that's a stationary time series or not is up to an econometric test. Here, you have to be nuts, to be frank, to say this is a stationary time series. Because, you know, you would have to assume that This is just a matter of time until this goes up again, right? There's a trend. So why is there a downward trend in the real exchange rate, right? That's something that is not compatible with relative purchasing power parity. So the road ahead, and that will keep us busy until lunch with a 15-minute break, is that I will go deeper into the real exchange rate. The bottom line being, there's much more to say about the real exchange rate than what purchasing power parity has to say. Purchasing power parity is not a completely useless concept, but it's something that is too simplistic to really give justice to the many things that are going on and that are affecting the real exchange rate. So the road ahead is that the first thing I'll do is I will focus on trade costs and non-traded goods. And I will argue that trade costs and non-traded goods are causes of deviations from purchasing power parity, which is kind of obvious, right? By the end of the day, goods arbitrage is not costless. So there's actually no arbitrage. If you want to transport one good from one country to another, it's costly. Now, if we have, in an extreme case, we have non-traded goods, and non-traded goods mean that it's prohibitively costly. So you basically have to consume the good where it's produced. Now, the Balazs-Samuelson model uses this and uses this fact and argues if once we include non-traded goods, we can explain the things that I've just highlighted, namely the alleged undervaluation of poor countries' currencies and the alleged overvaluation of rich countries' currencies. I will also highlight other fundamental explanations of deviations from PPP. The next thing will be to look at the real exchange rate in general equilibrium. We will look at the real exchange rate as a measure of price competitiveness. Is that actually a good idea? Should we be happy when the real exchange rate goes up? The answer is yes and no. Depends, as usual. What is the relationship between the real exchange rate and net exports, and tying things up, the current account of the real exchange rate in general equilibrium? So that's a lot of stuff on our plate. So let's go step by step. So the first question is, how can we explain deviations from absolute and relative PPP? So the failure of the law of one price and fluctuations of Q. Now please note that relative purchasing power parity is the less demanding concept, right? Absolute purchasing power parity is very demanding because it claims that goods should cost the same all over the country, all over the world. Relative PPP allow for constant price differences across countries, but these price differences may change, and this may give rise to fluctuations of the real exchange rate, and this in turn violates a relative PPP. So the reply to that question, how can we explain deviations from absolute and relative PPP, is we have existence of trade barriers. See the current American government. I mean, what will the trade barriers generate? Price differences between what the good costs in Europe and what the good costs in the United States. That's what tariffs are meant to generate, right? So you sell the Mercedes in Germany, or you sell it in the United States. If you sell it in the United States, you have to, customers have to pay 25%, 40%, 165%, 1,000% of tariffs. Don't know what comes to the president's mind. And that, of course, makes it more costly. Trade costs also drive a wedge between what something costs in this country and that country. So if you have to ship a mango from Vietnam to Germany, it's not surprising that the mango is more expensive in Germany than it is in Vietnam, because the trade cost is included in the price. The second thing is non-traded goods. So there's goods that have to be consumed where they are produced, right? A haircut. You cannot ship a haircut across countries, right? You have to go to the person cutting your hair. I mean, maybe in about 10 years' time, you will have some device that you put in your head, and then someone sits in Ho Chi Minh City and cuts your hair. Okay, well, I suppose that's an issue, right? Trim your nails or whatever. I mean, in Germany we have a lot of, we have a plethora of these shops where people can get color on their nails. Don't know whether that's, anyway, I think it's a waste of time, but if you like doing this or like, anyway. So, next thing is, if you want to see a sunset on the Mediterranean, right, you have to travel to Italy or Spain. I mean, if you want an authentic sunset on the Mediterranean, it doesn't make sense. You can watch it on video, and you maybe put some glasses on, some artificial intelligence enhanced thing, but by the end of the day, right, people move to Italy to enjoy tourism in, Italy. Okay, now importantly for non-traded goods arbitrage is not possible because it's just, they have to. So I'll give you an example in a second. First remark is prices of most goods consist of a traded and a non-traded component. That will be very important later on. So there's a thing called retail services. And retail services is, of course, when I go to Benkat and I buy a mango from the person selling on the street, probably the retail service is not so big. But when in Germany I buy a banana or a mango, I go to a supermarket. And the supermarket is related to a wholesale company. The wholesale company buys the mango that arrives in Rotterdam or Hamburg or Antwerp. These are the big European ports, and ships it to the shop, and then someone puts the stuff into the shelf, and then I pick it off the shelf. So the retail service component is very important, and that's a non-traded component. So every retail price is not just the price of the banana, but also the price of the person who puts the banana into the shelf, who transports it from the port to the shop, ... Secondly, and that is a very dark remark, right? We are treating all non-traded goods as being non-tradable. Now, non-tradability is different from non-tradedness. What's the point? When you talk about non-traded, you allow for the possibility that this changes. That something that was not traded in the past is traded in the present. Now, there is a thing in trade called the so-called Melitz model, which revolutionized trade theory in the early 2000s. And the Melitz model is all about firms' decision to trade things. So trading things is a firm decision, depending on all kinds of things, costs and also technology. Let me give you an example. University teaching. I mean, before COVID, say 2015, we thought this is a non-traded thing, non-tradable. If you want to get taught, you have to go to a place. Now, COVID forced us to do online teaching, and we learned that you can actually do that. Now, I argue it's not quite the same thing, right? But some people say, it doesn't make a difference sitting in a classroom or sitting on my chair at home and looking at the computer. So the term non-tradable sounds like this is carved in stone. The term non-traded allows for the possibility that goods and services are shifting from being non-traded to being traded. That's an exciting evolution. Now, the real exchange rate Q fluctuates if these forces that drive wedges between prices in different countries allow for time-varying international price differences. If these price differences are constant, then the real exchange rate may be constant. But if these things fluctuate over time, if these price differences fluctuate over time, then we have a lot of action in the real exchange rate. So, this is one of my favorite pictures. Again, I'm using UBS data. UBS is a Swiss bank, and remember, I told you yesterday, they publish data on what things cost in different countries relative to New York City. So this is the international distribution of prices of a standardized basket of home electronics. Now, the UBS commissioned a company to do that and to go to shops in Bangkok, Sydney, Buenos Aires, Tokyo, Frankfurt, Rio de Janeiro, maybe Ho Chi Minh City, and figure out what does a combination of a hairdryer, a microwave oven, whatever, something else cost, a toaster oven cost. And you get a distribution that tells you, well, there's quite substantial international price differences. In some countries, that basket costs about 80% of what it costs in New York. In some countries, it costs 130%. However, most of the mass of the distribution is very close to 100. So for that standardized basket of home electronics, international price differences are there, but they're not that big. Now the second picture is, and that's also UBS, what UBS said, we want to know what does a 5-kilometer taxi ride cost? And you see that the price dispersion is gigantic, right? So there's countries where the 5-kilometer taxi ride costs about 20% of what it costs in New York. And there's other countries where it costs more than 200%. What's the point? The point is obvious. Suppose you're taking a taxi in Japan, Tokyo, and you want to go from Shibuya to Shinjuku, which are 2 quarters. And you ask the taxi driver, which is a smart decision in advance, what will it cost? And the taxi driver gives you a price, and you get a heart attack, right? Because it's so much. And you tell the taxi driver, look, I come from Mainz, and there's 2 places. One is called Budenheim, and the other one is Bodenheim, and they're both close to Mainz. And if I took a cab from Budenheim to Bodenheim, it would just cost about 60% of what you're charging me. What would the Japanese taxi driver tell you? This is Japan. If you want to go from Shibuya to Shinjuku, you have to pay the Japanese price, right? On Sunday, I took a Grab car from center of Ho Chi Minh City out to VGU. You are shocked in a negative way. I was shocked in a positive way. Because I would pay an arm and a leg for such a taxi ride in Germany. It would cost me several hundreds of euros. Sitting in a cab for an hour and a half, I mean, the distance is not very long, right? It's about 40 something kilometers. But it would cost, getting from Mainz to Frankfurt Airport, which is about 40 kilometers, costs you 150 euros. Right? Now, so I had the same reaction before, right? The point is, taking a taxi would have been more expensive. The Grab car was the cheaper alternative, and there was just no bus going, right? And I had to be here because I had to get some work done. So anyway, you see that there's enormous differences in the taxi ride is the typical non-traded good, right? You cannot do goods arbitrage. You cannot if you want to go from one part, Tokyo is excessive, right? If you want to go from Shibuya to Shinjuku, then it doesn't make sense to say, look, you cannot arbitrage it with the trip from Budenheim to Bodenheim, or from, say, from A to B in Ho Chi Minh City, right? So there's big differences in these non-traded goods prices. And this holds the secret for explaining differences in aggregate price levels. And I think that this is a good point in time to take a break. Well, let me take a break now. Good. So let me keep showing this to you because I think it's an impressive graph. Now the sad thing is, this is not UFresh data, right? It's 10 years old, and I recently tried to update it because UBS publish this publication every, say, 5 years. The sad thing is they don't do that anymore. They tell you, look, this data is available elsewhere, but it's in fact not. I mean, it's very hard to get this crisp, what does a 5-kilometer taxi ride data cost data somewhere else? So UBS, probably the public relations department has said, look, we don't have to do that, it's costly, so let's skip it. Sad thing, but still we have that data. And I think it tells a very important story. All right, so I think we take a break, and then I will come back at 10:45 to